The chamber was never truly quiet, even when no one spoke it breathed, it hummed with the soft sounds of translation devices, the shifting of alien bodies in seats built for dozens of different shapes, and the low electronic pulse of the lighting grid that kept the massive hall visible to eyes of every kind. The grand conclave chamber of the Interstellar Covenant was one of the largest rooms ever built by living hands. It sat at the center of a space station that had taken 40 years and 11 species to construct, orbiting the slow, golden, massive Varith Prime. 61 civilizations had a seat in that room. 61 flags hung from the curved ceiling. 61 voices could speak there. In theory, on this day, only one voice mattered. The Dretch High Speaker stood at the main podium. He was tall by most standards, with dark gray skin that looked almost metallic under the chamber lights, 4 thick arms folded across a broad chest, and eyes that were completely black from edge to edge. He wore the ceremonial armor of the Dretch Dominion, deep red plates trimmed with the gold markings that recorded every world they had ever conquered. There were many markings. He looked out at the assembled delegates with the easy calm of someone who had never once been told no. His name was Vakrath. He had given speeches like this before, 14 times to be exact. He tapped the podium once, and the room fell into the kind of silence that only happened when everyone was afraid. The Dretch Dominion, he said, his voice moving through the translators in a smooth, flat wave, hereby formally announces its intent to bring the planet Earth and its surrounding system under Dominion authority. The process will begin in 90 standard cycles. We have reviewed the planet's defenses. We have reviewed its military capacity. We have reviewed its population and its resources. He paused, not for effect. Just because he could. The outcome is not in question. He stepped back from the podium. That was it. No demands, no negotiation. Offer no warning to evacuate. The Dreth never gave warnings. Warnings implied that the other side had options. The room stayed silent for a long moment, then slowly the noise came back. Not the normal background hum, but something lower and more nervous. Delegates leaned toward each other. Translation devices flickered with urgent whispers. On the far left side of the chamber, the myriad empires representative was already looking at his personal screen, probably sending messages back home. On the upper tier, the Kreth collective's 3-bodied delegates sat perfectly still, which meant they were thinking very hard. Ambassador Velthara of the Usan sat in the middle section, in a seat designed for a body with 6 limbs and a wide base. She was old by Usan standards, old enough to remember the last time the Dreth had made an announcement like this about a world called Velsura IV. She remembered the footage that came after. She did not like remembering it. She turned her cluster of amber eyes slowly toward the section reserved for the human delegation. It was empty. The chair, the nameplate, the small water container kept there by station staff out of habit, all present. The human not present. The planet Earth had been a Covenant observer for 22 years. In that time, their delegation had attended most sessions, voted on minor matters, and generally kept quiet. They were not a powerful voice in the chamber. They were new. They were small. By galactic standards, they had only one star system. Velthara stared at the empty seat and felt something she did not have a good word for. It was not quite fear, it was more like the feeling of standing near the edge of something and not being able to see the bottom. Then the doors opened. The main doors of the Grand Conclave chamber were built to impress. They were 12 tall, made from a dark alloy that reflected light in deep blue tones, and they opened slowly and with great ceremony. No one was supposed to enter the chamber after a formal address had begun. It was a rule, a very old rule. The doors did not care about the rule. Neither, apparently, did the man who walked through them. He was not tall, he was not large, he wore no ceremonial clothing, no diplomatic silks, no rank sash of any color. He wore a military jacket, dark green, slightly worn at the cuffs, with a row of small campaign ribbons on the left chest that most people in the room could not read, but a few could, and those few went very still when they did. His hair was short and gray at the sides. His face was calm in a way that was different from Vakreth's calm. Vakreth was calm because he felt no threat. This man was calm the way deep water is calm, flat on top and completely unknowable underneath. His name was Jonah's Wrath. His official title was Captain Ambassador, a rank that did not exist in normal Covenant diplomatic structure because humans had invented it 3 years ago and had not explained why. He walked to the human delegation's podium without hurrying. He did not look at Vakreth. He did not look at the crowd. He set a small data chip on the podium's reader surface with a soft click, looked up once at the room, and then looked directly at the Dureth High Speaker. "We received your message," he said. His voice was quiet. The translators carried it perfectly to every part of the room. "Here is ours." He pressed the chip. The chamber's main display screen, large enough to be seen from every seat, lit up. What played was not a speech. It was not a counter-declaration or a formal protest. It was footage, compiled footage, clearly organized, clearly labeled in several languages. It showed star maps, fleet movement patterns, supply route diagrams, battle simulations rendered in sharp detail, showing engagements that had not happened yet, projections, war game results, probability chains, timestamps, coordinates, resource counts. It was in total a complete strategic breakdown of the Dureth dominions military, their strengths, their weaknesses, their supply lines, their communication delays, their historical tactical patterns, and the exact points at which each of those patterns had failed, could fail, or would fail under specific conditions. It ran for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. When it finished, the screen went dark. The room did not make a sound. Velthara realized she had not moved in over 4 minutes. She made herself breathe. She looked at Vakreth. The High Speaker was standing in exactly the same position as before, but something had changed in his face. It was a small change, a tightening around the eyes, a slight shift in the set of his jaw. She had seen Vakreth before in other sessions and recorded addresses. She had never seen that expression on him. She looked back at the human. Jonah's wreath was still standing at the podium. He had not moved. He was still looking at Vakreth. He was not smiling. He was not angry. He was simply looking the way a person looks at something they have already figured out. After a moment, he reached out, picked up his data chip from the reader, and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he sat down in his seat in the human delegation. Section, the one that had been empty 5 minutes ago. He sat down, folded his hands on the desk in front of him, and waited. The chamber stayed silent. Somewhere in the upper tier, a junior delegate from a small world called Pertho dropped his translation device. The sound of it hitting the floor echoed through the whole room. Nobody looked at it. They were all looking at either Vakreth, who had not yet spoken, or at the human, who seemed to have nothing more to say, and was apparently perfectly comfortable with that. Velthara turned to her aide, a young Asan named Sella, who was sitting rigidly beside her with all 6 of her limbs held very close to her body. "Pull everything we have on Earth," Velthara said quietly. "Everything. Tonight." Sella nodded once fast and started typing. The station did not sleep. It was built for species from 47 different star systems, and many of those species did not sleep at all, or slept in short cycles spread their day, or slept with half their brain at a time. So the corridors were always lit, the food stations were always open, and the data networks were always running. But there was a difference between a normal night on the station and the night that followed the Dreth announcement. On a normal night, the activity was routine. On this night, every government office on the station had lights burning. Every secure communication channel was busy, and the Covenant's main intelligence archive was receiving more access requests than it had seen in 11 years. Everyone wanted to know about humans. It was embarrassing in a way how little most of them had bothered to find out before. Earth had been observed and catalogued by Covenant scouts for over 2 centuries. The initial reports were not alarming. The planet was biologically rich, with a dominant species, humans, that had developed technology at a pace that was fast but not unusual. They had wars. Many developing worlds had wars. They had internal divisions, political conflicts, resource struggles. Again, not unusual. The scout reports were filed, cross-referenced, and placed in the lower priority section of the archive, alongside 200 other developing worlds. Then a more detailed survey team had gone in 60 years later and found something odd. The humans had, in the time since the first survey, developed nuclear weapons. This was not entirely unexpected. Many species discovered nuclear technology at roughly the same point in their development. What was unexpected was what came next. Most species, upon developing weapons capable of destroying their own world, either used them in a final catastrophic war or were so frightened by them that they built tight international control systems almost immediately. Humans had done neither. They had built enormous stockpiles of these weapons. They had pointed them at each other for decades. They had come extremely close to using them multiple times on at least 6 documented occasions, and then slowly, without any single dramatic moment of change, they had pulled back, not because they were forced to, not because an outside power intervened, just because enough of them decided that it was not the right outcome. The xenosociologist who read that report argued about it for years. No one could fully explain it. The closest anyone came was a Usan researcher named Daloth, who wrote a paper suggesting that humans had a psychological trait that was extraordinarily rare in sapient species: the ability to hold extreme aggression and extreme self-restraint, the same mind at the same time, and choose between them based on context in ways that were not fully predictable by outside observers. The paper was considered interesting and then mostly forgotten. It was being read again tonight in several offices at once. Velthara sat at the desk in her private quarters with a cup of warm usin broth. She had not drunk, and a screen full of files she was reading with all of her eyes at once, which was the usin equivalent of reading very fast. Sela sat across from her, pulling new files as Velthara finished each one, organizing them, flagging the ones that seemed most important. The file Velthara was reading right now was flagged at the highest level. 200 years ago, shortly after the Dreth had begun expanding in their current direction, a standard Dreth long-range probe had been sent into the Sol system. Standard practice, the Dreth cataloged everything in their future path decades in advance. The probe had been small, quiet, and designed to be invisible to the kind of technology Earth had at the time. It had entered the outer system, done a sweep, and transmitted its data back to Dreth space. The probe had never returned because something had caught it. The Dreth had noted the loss and assumed a navigation failure. It happened occasionally with long-range probes. They had sent a second one 10 years later, same result. They had sent a third, this one with a self-destruct trigger designed to fire if the probe detected that it was being handled. The self-destruct had not fired. The probe had simply disappeared. The Dretch had reclassified Earth as a low-tech world with some kind of unusual spatial debris field and moved on. What Velthara was reading now was a Covenant intelligence report from 40 years ago, compiled by a researcher who had managed to get access to a human military archive through a very complicated series of diplomatic favors. The report said in plain language that all 3 Dretch probes had been caught, studied, and disassembled. The propulsion technology from the first probe had been reverse engineered within 8 years and was now the foundation of Earth's deep space drive system. The communication array from the second probe had been studied and used to build a quantum relay network that Earth officially described as a civilian infrastructure project. The third probe's guidance system had been taken apart component by component and cataloged in a military research facility under a classification level so high that the Covenant researcher who found it was not able to read the actual contents, only the cover file, which said in human writing in plain letters 4. Later, Velthara set down her broth cup. "Sela," she said. "Yes, Ambassador." "The data chip, the one the human left on the podium, did we get a copy of it?" "We did." Station archivists pulled a secondary record from the display system. Automatically, standard procedure. "Open it." Sela opened it. It was one file, one single document organized into sections, each one labeled with the name of a Dreth military campaign. There were 14 sections, one for each of the 14 worlds the Dreth had taken. Each section contained the same structure, a full breakdown of how the Dreth had conducted the campaign, what strategies they had used, where their supply lines had run, how long their communication delays were, what tactical errors they had made even in their victories, and what an opposing force would have needed to do to change the outcome. At the end of each section were numbers. Simulation results run to 10,000. Iterations minimum, some run to 40,000. Showing what various defensive and offensive strategies would have produced. Under those conditions, this document had not been written. Recently, the earliest dated entries were from over 60 years ago. Humans had been compiling this analysis. For 60 years, they had been updating it, refining it, running new simulations on it every time the Dreth made another move, every time new data became available, every time they got their hands on another piece of technology they were not supposed to have. For 60 years, while the rest of the galaxy had watched the Dreth expand and said nothing, Earth had been studying them, not out of fear, not out of desperation, with patience, with focus, with the particular kind of quiet, long-term preparation that Dolith's old paper had tried and failed to fully explain. Velthara looked at the last page of the document. It was a summary one paragraph. She read it 3 times. It said that the Dreth's single greatest vulnerability, it not their fleet strength or their supply lines or their tactical patterns, it was their certainty. They had won 14 times without serious resistance. They did not know how to fight someone who was ready for them. They had never had to. At the bottom of that paragraph, there was a note. It was dated 11 years ago, and it was addressed to no one in particular, written in the way people sometimes write when they are recording a thought for themselves. It said, waiting for the right they'll announce. First, they always do. Velthara sat very still for a long time. Then she said quietly, they knew the Dreth would announce it. Publicly, they knew this moment was coming and they used it. She paused. They used our chamber. They used the Dreth's own tradition of public declaration to put that footage in front of every civilization in the known galaxy at once. Sella was very quiet. Then she said, Ambassador, should we be frightened of the Dreth right now, or of the humans? Velthara picked up her broth, found it had gone cold, and set it down again. That, she said, is exactly the right question. The emergency session was called for the following morning. Station clocks ran on a universal standard cycle, and by the time the chamber lights came up to full brightness and the delegates began filling their seats again, most of them had not rested. They looked at, eyes were tired, postures were stiff, small conversations happened in tight clusters. Before people took their seats, the kind of conversations where voices stay low and bodies lean in close. The Dreth delegation was not present. Vokred had returned to their docked warship the previous evening and had not communicated with the station since. His empty seat sat at the far end of the chamber like a cold space in the room, noticed by everyone and mentioned by no one. Jonah's wreath was present. He was seated in the human section before most other delegates arrived with a plain metal cup of something warm in front of him and a small personal screen he was reading without any visible concern. He looked like someone waiting for a transport connection. He looked like someone who had already decided how the day was going to go. The session chair, a large gray-skinned Murath official named presiding delegate Zareth, called the room to order and stated the matter plainly. The Covenant needed to determine its official position on the Dretch's declared intention to invade Earth. The options were 3. The Covenant could formally intervene, meaning it would send a combined fleet to defend Earth. It could formally condemn the invasion, meaning it would say publicly that the invasion was wrong without taking any military action, or it could take no official position and leave the Matter between the Dretch Dominion and the planet Earth. Sareth listed the options in that order, because that was protocol. Everyone in the room already knew which option was going to win. The Kreth Collective spoke first. Their three-bodied delegate rose from the shared seat they used and delivered a carefully constructed speech about the importance of covenant neutrality, the dangers of escalation, and the long history of non-interference that had kept the peace between major powers. It was a good speech. It was also clearly a speech that had been prepared in advance of this session, possibly in advance of the Dretch announcement itself. The Kreth had seen this coming and had their position ready. The Murath Empire's representative spoke. Next, he was shorter than most in the room but wore the kind of formal uniform that was designed to make its wearer look larger. He spoke about the complexity of the situation, the need for careful deliberation, and the importance of not making hasty decisions based on one dramatic presentation. He did not look at Jonah's wrath while he said this. He was clearly trying very hard not to look at Jonah's wrath. 3 smaller nations spoke in favor of formal condemnation. Their delegates were younger and 2 of them looked genuinely distressed. One of them, a female delegate from a world called Tyeth, said plainly that 61 civilizations sitting silent while one planet was invaded was not neutrality. It was cowardice, and she was not willing to vote for cowardice. Chamber received this in silence. No one argued with her. No one agreed with her out loud either. Velthara spoke forth. She stood at the Usin podium and looked out at the room for a moment before she spoke, the way she sometimes did when she was choosing her words carefully. She said that she had spent the night reading everything the Covenant had on Earth, and she was going to say something that people in the room might not want to hear. She said that humanity was not the defenseless developing world this chamber had been treating it as. She said that the data she had reviewed suggested Earth had been preparing for exactly this situation for longer than most of the civilizations in this room had been members of the Covenant. She said that if the Covenant chose not to intervene, it should not do so under the comfortable belief that Earth was simply going to be destroyed. She said the Covenant should make its choice with full awareness that it was choosing to stand aside from a conflict that might end very differently than anyone expected. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Sareth called for the vote. Formal military intervention, 4 votes. In favor, 16 abstentions, 41 against. Formal condemnation only, 31 votes in favor, the rest abstaining. No official position, 9 votes in favor. The final result, therefore, was formal condemnation. A statement would be issued, words would be said, nothing would be done. Sareth announced the result and looked toward the human delegation as protocol required. It was custom in the case of a matter directly concerning a member world to allow that world's delegation brief response after a vote. Everyone in the room looked at Jonas. Reith had been still throughout the entire session. He had not used his screen. He had not conferred with anyone. He had sat with his hands folded on the desk and listened to 4 hours of debate about the fate of his planet, with the expression of a man watching weather move across a landscape he already knew very well. Now he looked up. He looked at Sareth. He looked at the result display on the main screen, and then slowly the corner of his mouth moved. He smiled just barely, just enough to see. It did not reach his eyes. "Good," he said, the translator carried it flat and clear to every corner of the room. Sareth blinked. "Captain Ambassador, the Covenant wishes to express that this result does not reflect indifference to." "I understand the result," Reith said. Not rudely, just firmly. "I said good, I meant it." The room did not know what to do with this. Delegates looked at each other. The Murath representatives carefully composed expression slipped for just a second. Velthara leaned forward. "Jonas," she said, using his name rather than his title, which was not protocol but felt necessary. "Do you understand what the Dareth did to Velsora IV?" Reth turned to look at her. His expression did not change. "We've read the reports," he said thoroughly. Multiple times. He paused. "We've also run the numbers. The Dareth have never fought anyone who wanted them to attack." The room tried to absorb this. Velthara stared at him. "You wanted them to attack?" He did not confirm or deny it. He simply held her gaze for a moment. Then he stood up. He buttoned the top button of his jacket, a small, unhurried gesture, and picked up his cup and his screen. He looked around the chamber once, not with anger, not with contempt, just with a calm, comprehensive look that seemed to take in every face in the room and file it away somewhere. "Thank you for your time," he said to Soreth. Then he walked out. Within 40 minutes, every human on the station was gone. They left quietly, without announcement, without checking out at the diplomatic offices, as protocol required. Their quarters were clean, their temporary data accounts were closed, and the small water container at the human delegation's desk had been washed and left upside down on a paper towel, which was a level of tidiness that somehow made the whole thing more unsettling rather than less. The chamber staff found a single folded note under the water container. It was addressed to Velthara by name. She opened it in her office with Sela watching. It said, "Don't worry, stay out of the corridor between Mars and the asteroid belt for the next 90 cycles, Jr." Velthara read it twice, then she set it down on her desk and stared at the wall. Sela said very quietly, "Ambassador, did humanity just use this chamber as a stage?" Velthara thought about the footage from the night before. She thought about Reth's face when the vote came in. She thought about the note. They needed the Dreth to commit their full fleet, she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. They needed a reason the Dreth would believe, a public announcement, a formal declaration, something that would make the Dreth too proud to back down, and they needed every civilization watching. She picked up the note again. They've been ready for a long time. They just needed the right moment and the right room. She looked at the empty doorway where Jonas Reth had walked out an hour ago. "And we gave it to them," she said. "Every single one of us." The Dreth fleet was the largest assembled force in the known galaxy. That was not pride speaking, that was simply a number. 1,400 warships gathered over the course of 60 cycles in a staging area 3 light years from the Sol system, supply vessels, troop carriers, bombardment platforms built specifically for cracking the surface of inhabited worlds when full conquest was not the goal. When Vakreth stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the fleet spread across the tactical display, it looked like a map of power made physical. It looked like the end of a conversation. Before the conversation began, he gave the order to jump. 1,400 ships folded space and moved. They came out of faster than light. Travel at the outer edge of the Sol system, exactly where the approach calculations said to arrive, a cold, dark stretch of space well beyond the outer planets where a fleet could form up, take readings, and planets advance without being immediately engaged. Standard approach doctrine. It had worked on 14 other worlds. There was no reason to think it would be different. Here, the first officer called out the standard arrival report, fleet formation. Intact, all ships accounted for, no hostile contacts detected. Vakrath said nothing. He was looking at the long-range sensor display. The system was quiet, completely quiet. No communication signals from the planet, no emergency broadcasts, no defensive fleet forming up in the inner system, no response of any kind to the appearance of 1,400 warships on the edge of their star system. Just the slow turning of planets and the dim light of a medium-sized yellow star at the center of it all. They know we're here, the sensor officer said. She sounded uncertain about whether this was good news or bad. No reaction. Vakrath clasped two of his four hands behind his back. Advance, he said. The fleet moved inward, past the cold outer planets, past the gas giants, into the middle system where the asteroid belt sat between the outer and inner planets like a wide broken ring of rock. The approach calculations had already accounted for the asteroid belt. It was a navigation hazard that required course adjustment, but nothing unusual. Every rocky system had debris fields. The sensor officer made a sound. It was not a word. It was a short, sharp sound that Vakrath recognized as the sound of someone looking at something. That did not make sense. Speak, he said. The asteroids, she said. Her voice was careful in the way that voices go. Careful when they are trying to stay calm. The map positions they don't match. Navigation drift. Account for it. Sir, it's not drift. She turned from her screen to look at him. In 14 years of service on Dareth vessel, she had never turned from her screen to look at a commander without being addressed. First she turned now. The asteroids have moved, not drifted, moved. The positions are there arranged. There are corridors through the belt that weren't there before, and the outer edges of the belt have been pushed inward on 3 sides. If we continue on current course, we will be in a channel approximately 900 km wide that has rock walls on 4 sides. And she stopped. She looked at her screen again, and the rocks are not drifting, they are holding position. Vakrath looked at the tactical display. The asteroid belt covered an enormous area of space. It had always been treated as a hazard to navigate around or through with care. He looked at it now and saw what he should have seen. Immediately, what he would have seen if he had been expecting it. It was not a field anymore. It was walls. It was a structure. The rocks had been moved, thousands of them, positioned and locked in place over the course of many cycles, turning a navigational hazard into something else entirely, turning it into a canyon. Pull back, he said. He said it calmly. He said it the way he said every order, flat, clear, immediate. But in all his years of command, in 14 campaigns, in countless engagements and demonstrations of force, he had never said those 2 words before. They felt strange in his mouth. The fleet began to pull back. It was too late. From the dark sides of every moon in the inner system they came, not quickly, not with the roaring speed of a dramatic charge. They came with the steady, unhurried movement of things that had been waiting for a very long time and were not in a hurry now. Ships of every shape and size, warships, yes, proper military vessels with weapon systems that were more sophisticated than anything the Dretch intelligence files had ever attributed to Earth, but not only warships, large ore haulers with magnetic rail guns bolted to their sides, the barrels long and thick and pointed outward with the simple, practical look of tools built by engineers rather than weapons designers. Deep space mining platforms, enormous structures that had been stationed in the outer belt for years, apparently mining, actually serving as artillery positions, their drill mechanisms replaced with mass driver arrays that could throw projectiles across hundreds of thousands of kilometers with extraordinary accuracy. Civilian transport vessels in configurations that had been clearly modified, their cargo bays open, releasing swarms of small unmanned drones that spread out like clouds of dark points against the star field and began targeting sensor arrays on Dretch ships with a focused, methodical precision. There were thousands of them, not just military vessels, everything Earth had converted, everything that could move and carry a weapon, and apparently quite a lot of things that by any normal lot should not have been able to do either. The first engagement lasted approximately 40 minutes. In that time, the lead portion of the Dretch fleet, trying to reverse course through a space that had been deliberately shaped to make reversing course difficult, lost 112 ships, not to a single weapon, not to a dramatic, decisive strike, but to 100 different things firing from 100 different positions with a coordination that was quiet and complete, and gave the impression of a system that had thought about exactly this moment. For a very long time, Vauquelin tried to reform the fleet into an offensive posture. His commanders were good, they had done this before. They pushed forward trying to break through and get into open space on the other side. It was the right tactical instinct in every previous campaign. Pushing through a defensive line into open space had worked because no defensive line had ever been deep enough to hold. Earth's defensive line was the entire inner solar system. The asteroids were not just walls, they were weapons. Some of them had been hollowed out and filled with explosives, positioned in the approach channel so that when a ship traveled through, the detonation of a single asteroid released debris at velocity from every direction. Simultaneously, some had mass drivers attached, small, single-shot devices remotely triggered, designed to throw a single very large rock at a very specific angle at a specific moment. Some were simply positioned to create channeling effects, forcing ships into kill zone where the mining platforms and the warships and the drone swarms were waiting in coordinated layers. The battle lasted 11 hours and 4 minutes. From first contact to the last exchange of fire. In that time the Dret Dominion lost 1,391 ships. The losses were not even across the battle. They were heaviest in the middle period when the fleet was fully inside the asteroid corridor and the full scope of what had been done to the solar system became clear to every Dret Commander, at once. There was a period of approximately 40 minutes in the middle of the battle when direct communication spiked with traffic. Volume unlike anything in their recorded history, as every ship tried to coordinate response to a situation that no Dreth training program had ever simulated, because no Dreth strategist had ever imagined it was necessary. The 9 ships that survived did not survive because they were lucky, they survived because they were allowed to. The pursuing human vessels broke off at a specific boundary point, clearly marked in the tactical data by a command that went out across all human ships at the same moment. The 9 Dreth ships were given a clear exit corridor. Their engines were not targeted, their communications were not jammed, they were let go. On the bridge of the last surviving Dreth warship, which was carrying Vakrath, the High Speaker stood at his tactical display and watched the pursuing ship stop. He watched the clear corridor open in front of him. He understood what it meant. He had done it himself twice to 2 different worlds. You let survivors go when you want the story told. He stood at his display for a long time. The battle was over. The Sol system was quiet again. Somewhere behind him, his bridge crew was not speaking. The damage reports were coming in across every screen, but no one was reading them aloud. The room was filled with the kind of silence that happens when people are trying to process something that does not fit inside the categories they have for understanding the world. Vakrath thought about the data chip. He thought about Jonah's Reth's face in the chamber. He thought about the line in that document waiting for the right moment. They'll announce first. They always do. He reached out and activated the fleet-wide broadcast. Set course, he said. His voice was steady. It was still the voice of a Dreth High Speaker, but it was steadier than it needed to be, in the way that things go too steady when everything else is trying to fall. Full speed home. Behind him, in the dark of the Sol system, 1,400 silhouettes of debris drifted slowly in the light of a yellow star, and the system was quiet. Completely quiet, just the slow turning of planets, and somewhere in all of that quiet, a planet with 7 billion people on. It went back to whatever it had been doing before. The 9 ships broadcast their sensor logs before they even made it back to Dreth space. It was not a decision made by Vakrath. It was made by the fleet's automated transmission system, which was designed to send battle data back to the Dominion's home fleet the moment ship's damage threshold crossed a certain point. The system was built for the possibility that a ship might be destroyed before it could report in person. It transmitted everything, the full sensor record of the entire battle from the moment the fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system to the moment the 9 ships were released through the exit corridor. 11 hours and 4 minutes of data. Complete, unedited, real. The Dreth had a secure military network. But secure networks in an interstellar civilization are only as secure as the people operating them. Within hours of the transmission reaching Dreth home space, copies of it were moving through back channels, diplomatic relay stations, and private communications networks across the known galaxy. By the end of the first day, it had reached every Covenant member world. By the end of the second day, it had reached worlds that were not members of the Covenant. By the end of the third day, there was no spacefaring civilization within communication reign. of the Dreth Covenant region of the galaxy that had not seen it. Everyone watched. It was not a short recording. 11 hours is a long time to sit and watch battle footage. Most people did not watch all of it at once. They watched pieces. They watched the opening when the Dreth fleet came out of FTL into the quiet of the outer Sol system, and the sensors picked up nothing. They watched the middle when the asteroid corridor revealed itself, and the mining platforms and the ore haulers and the drones came out of the dark side of every moon. They watched the 9 ships leaving through a corridor that had been deliberately cleared for them by an opponent that was still in full control of the battlefield and chose very specifically not to finish the fight completely. That last part, the 9 ships being let go, was the part that people kept coming back to. It was the part that military analysts on 20 different worlds pulled apart and discussed and argued about and could not stop thinking about, because it was not mercy. Everyone who looked at it understood that it was not mercy, it was a message. The 9 ships were a message sent back to every civilization that was watching, saying, we stopped because we chose to stop, not because we had to. The Covenant Council reconvened on the 8th day after the battle. No one was late. No one sent a junior delegate. For the first time in the recorded history of the Grand Conclave chamber, every single seat in the room was filled by the head of state or head of government of the civilization it represented. Rulers who had never personally attended a Covenant session were there. Leaders who would normally communicate only through their ambassadors were present in person, some of them having traveled for days to get there. The chamber was fuller than it had ever been, and it was the quietest it had ever been. Sarath, the presiding delegate, opened the session by playing the sensor log footage on the main display screen. This was not required by protocol. Everyone had already seen it. He played it anyway, and no one objected, because everyone seemed to understand instinctively that looking at it together in this room was something that needed to happen. The footage played in full, all 11 hours the chamber watched. By the time the 9 ships moved through the exit corridor and the display screen went dark, no one had spoken for over 11 hours. The room had been sitting together in silence for the length of a battle that had ended one of the most feared military forces in the known galaxy. When the screen went dark, the silence continued. 4 minutes and 22 seconds, Sarath counted, because counting felt like something to do. 4 minutes and 22 seconds of 61 civilizations sitting in a room together without making a sound. Then the Murath Emperor, Caliph III, who had personally traveled from the Murath homeworld and was sitting in a seat that had never been designed to hold someone of his size and clearly did not care about that at all, rose to his feet. He was the same emperor whose representative had spoken carefully about complexity and hasty decisions at the last session. He rose to his full height, which was considerable, and in a voice that carried no political carefulness whatsoever said that he wished to formally request the opening of comprehensive diplomatic relations between the Murath Empire and the planet Earth at the earliest opportunity. He sat down. 3 other heads of state rose immediately after him with similar requests. Sarath was still counting the seconds of silence in his head out of habit and had lost track. He looked around the room. He looked at the main doors of the chamber. He said to no one in particular, "Is the human delegation? Are they?" The doors opened. Jonas Reith walked in, same jacket, same expression. The campaign ribbons on his chest were visible from across the room, and this time Velthara noticed that several of the leaders who were present in person were looking at those ribbons with focused attention. He walked to the human delegation section, set down a plain metal cup of something warm, and sat. He looked around the room once, noting who was there, noting who had sent someone rather than come themselves. He looked at the main display screen, where the footage had just finished. He looked at Sareth. "Ready when you are," he said. Sareth opened his mouth and then closed it and then opened it again. "Captain Ambassador," he said carefully, "on behalf of the full Covenant Council, I want to say the result of our last vote regarding intervention is already in the past," Reith said. Not harshly, simply. Sareth seemed to be trying to find the right words for something that did not have right words. There is a desire on the part of many members to discuss more formal relationship with Earth, with humanity, in light of, he gestured generally at the dark display screen, recent events. "We're aware," Reith said. Velthara had been watching him since he came in. She had spent the 8 days since the battle reading and thinking, and rereading the note he had left for her, and thinking some more. She leaned forward now and said, "Jonas, I have one question before we go any further. I want one honest answer." He looked at her. "Was any of it improvised?" she said. "Even a small part of it, or was all of it planned completely from the moment the Dreth made their announcement?" The room was very still. Reth was quiet for a moment. He looked at his cup. He looked at the display screen. He looked at Velthara. "The announcement was the best thing that ever happened to us," he said. His voice was quiet. It was not a proud voice. It was a voice that had thought about something very carefully for a very long time. "We needed a reason the council would accept. If we had acted first without provocation, it would have looked different, but the Dreth announced in this room in front of everyone. They gave us a reason, and they gave us an audience." He paused. "We needed them to commit their full fleet. A partial engagement wouldn't have sent the right message, and we needed everyone watching when it happened." He looked around the room at the heads of state, at the rulers who had never attended a session before, at the full chamber. "Earth has been ready for this conversation for a very long time," he said. "We just needed the right room." The silence that followed was different from the silence during the footage. That silence had been shock. This silence was the sound of 61 civilizations doing arithmetic. Because every leader in that room, every analyst behind every leader, every military commander watching on relay screens on their home worlds was running the same calculation simultaneously. If Earth had done that to the Dreth, too, the Dreth who had taken 14 worlds without serious resistance, who had the largest fleet in the region, who had spent 60 years preparing this specific campaign, then what was Earth capable of against a force that had not been studied for 60 years, against a civilization that had not given Earth time to prepare, against anyone who came at them without the particular disadvantage of having been watched, cataloged, simulated, and outmaneuvered before the first shot was fired? They did not know That was the point. They did not know, and now they knew. That they did not know, and that was a very different and much more important thing than simply not knowing. Velthara looked at Jonah's wrath for a long moment, then she looked at the room, 61 civilizations, thousands of years of combined history, sitting very still. She had spent 40 years as an ambassador. She had sat in this chamber through wars and treaties and collapses and rebuildings. She had seen powers rise and decline and rise again. She had thought she understood most things about how the galaxy worked. She picked up her pen, an old using habit, writing by hand when thinking, and she wrote 4 words at the top of her notes for the session. She looked at what she had written. We never saw them. She underlined it once. Then she sat down, her pen straightened in her seat, and looked at Jonah's wrath, who was sitting calmly with his hands folded on the table, waiting for the most important diplomatic session in Earth's history to begin. And in every corner of that vast, ancient, many-voiced chamber, not one of the 61 civilizations of the interstellar covenant could find it in themselves to move first. And the great hall of the galactic conclave was big enough to swallow a city. Its ceiling stretched so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top. The walls were made of dark crystal that caught the light of 1,000 stars through massive windows. 34 species sat in curved rows around a central platform, their seats arranged by power and age. The oldest and most powerful sat closest to the center. Everyone else sat where they were told. Humanity sat near the back. Ambassador Elena Vasquez had been doing this job for 11 years. She had sat in that same chair in that same back row and watched the powerful races of the galaxy make decisions that affected billions of people without ever asking those people what they wanted. She had learned to keep her face calm. She had learned to keep her voice steady. She had learned above all to listen very carefully, because in rooms like this, the most important things were never said out loud. Today felt different. She noticed it the moment she walked in. The Vreth delegates were not looking at their data pads the way they usually did. They were looking at her. All 5 of them in their tall silver robes, with their 4 pale eyes each and their wide, flat faces. They were watching her the way a person watches something they are about to step on. She sat down. She opened her data pad. She waited. The session began like every other session. A conclave speaker read out the agenda in the common tongue: trade, disputes, border corrections, a resource conflict in the outer ring that had been going on for decades and would probably go on for decades more. Vasquez made small notes. She drank her water. She listened. Then the speaker paused. He looked down at his data pad for a long moment. Then he said the words that changed everything. We will now move to the special agenda. Items submitted by the Vreth hegemony and co-signed by 22 member states. The item concerns the status of the Terran Union and its continued membership in the Galactic Conclave. The hall went very quiet. Vasquez set down her stylus. High Chancellor Sovrith of the Vreth hegemony rose from his seat at the center of the hall. He was tall even for a Vreth, with a long neck and hands that had too many fingers. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and cold, like something that had never been warm. He spoke for 40 minutes. He talked about humanity's expansion, the new colonies humans had built in 3 different star systems over the last 20 years. He called this aggressive territorial seizure. He talked about human culture spreading to younger species who had not yet found their own way. He called this cultural contamination. He talked about human technology developing faster than the conclave had predicted. He called this a threat to galactic stability. He never once raised his voice. He never once looked at Vasquez directly. He spoke about humanity the way someone might speak about a pest problem, unfortunate, inconvenient, and in need of a solution. When he finished, the vote was called. The result came in less than 3 minutes. 28 in favor, 6 against. The Galactic Conclave formally declared war on the Terran Union. The 6 races that voted against were small ones: the Queth, a quiet insected species; the Harani, who lived on ocean worlds and rarely sent more than 2 delegates; 4 others whose names most of the galaxy struggled to pronounce. They were good people, they were powerless people. Vasquez made a note of each of their names. After the vote, Sovrith turned and looked at her for the first time. He gave her what passed for a smile on a Vreth face, a slight tightening around the eyes, a small downward curve of the mouth. He heard that the Terran Union had 30 cycles to comply, 30 cycles to hand over all colonies outside the original human star system, 30 cycles to disarm the Terran defense force down to a peacekeeping level, 30 cycles to accept a conclave-appointed oversight council that would govern human expansion going forward. If these terms are not met, Sovrith said, the conclave will act. I think you understand what that means, Ambassador. Around the hall, many of the delegates were already talking among themselves. Some were laughing, not loudly. They were too polished for that, but she could see it in the way they leaned toward each other, in the quick glances they threw her way. They thought this was already finished. They thought humanity would look at 28 warring species and do the only sensible thing. They thought she was afraid. Vasquez closed her data pad. She did it slowly with both hands, smoothing the cover flat the way her grandmother used to smooth a tablecloth before a meal. She picked up her water glass and finished what was left in it. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and looked at Sovrith across the great hall. "High Chancellor," she said, and her voice carried clearly because the hall was still listening, "I have heard the conclave's position. I will pass it along to my government." She paused for exactly 1 breath. "You have made a terrible mistake. We will be in touch." She picked up her data pad. She walked to the exit. Her footsteps were the only sound in the entire hall for several long seconds. Behind her she heard laughter, actual laughter, now that they thought she couldn't see their faces. She heard Sovrith say something in his own language, and she heard other voices respond with amusement. She did not stop walking. She did not look back. She stepped through the great doors and into the corridor outside, where her assistant, a young man named Piero, was waiting with wide eyes and a pale face. "Ambassador," he said, "what do we do?" Vasquez looked at him for a moment. Then she did something that surprised him. She smiled, not a forced smile, not a polite smile, a real one, small and quiet, the kind that meant something she wasn't saying out loud. "We send a message home," she said. "Priority 1, full encryption, direct to the War Council." Piero blinked. "The War Council? Ambassador, that council hasn't been Officially convened since the contingency plans were last reviewed. Yes, she said, convene them now. Tell Admiral Nakamura that Omega is a go. She started walking down the corridor, then book us passage back to Earth. We won't be coming back here for a while. Piero hurried to keep up. What should the message to Nakamura say exactly? Vasquez thought about the hall behind her. She thought about Savrith's smile. She thought about 28 species laughing at the back row humans who were supposed to bow their heads and comply. She thought about every year she had spent in that chair in that hall, being spoken over and looked past and treated like a minor problem that hadn't been properly dealt with yet. She thought about what she knew that they didn't. She thought about the ships, the real ones, the ones that didn't appear in any document the Conclave had ever been allowed to see. Tell her, Vasquez said, that they voted, and tell her that they have no idea what they just voted for. Piero sent the message. 34 species went home that night, believing the war was already won, that humanity would count the numbers, measure the fleets, look at the odds, and understand that resistance was pointless, that within 30 cycles, human ambassadors would return to the Conclave with their heads down and their signatures ready. They had studied human history, of course, or they thought they had. They knew about the wars humans had fought among themselves. They knew about the violence, but they had drawn the wrong lesson from it. They thought it meant humans broke easily. They had not read carefully enough, because anyone who had truly read human history, all of it, the long and bloody and stubborn length of it, would have noticed one very important thing. Humans had been backed into corners before many times by enemies stronger than them, better supplied than them, more numerous than them. They had never once stayed in the corner. The Conclave went asleep that night, confident and comfortable. Across the galaxy, in the quiet dark of space, something very old and very patient began to wake up. The message arrived on Earth at 3:47 hours ship time. It came in on a priority 1 chat that most people in the Terran Union government had never actually seen used before. It bypassed normal communication networks entirely, went through 3 layers of military encryption, and landed directly in the personal terminal of Admiral Hira Nakamura, who was sitting at her desk in the Terran Defense Command building outside Geneva, drinking tea and reading a report she had been expecting for years. She read Vasquez's message twice, then she set down her tea. Then she picked up the secure line and made 6 calls, one after another, each lasting less than 30 seconds. By 500 hours, the Emergency War Council was assembled. They met in a room deep underground, room with no windows, no outside connections, and walls thick enough to stop anything short of a direct hit from a capital ship. 14 people sat around plain metal table, no decorations, no ceremony. They all knew why they were there. Nakamura stood at the head of the table. She was 63 years old, small and lean, with short gray hair and the kind of stillness that came from spending 40 years doing the hardest job there was. She had never fought in a war. She had spent her entire career making sure humanity was ready for one. She put the Conclave's war declaration on the table in front of them. She let everyone read it. She gave them 2 minutes. Then she said, Omega. 1 word. Everyone in the room understood it. for the people outside that room, for ordinary citizens, for foreign governments, for the conclaves. Intelligence services, the Terran Defense Force was a modest military, respectable professional equipped for border protection and peacekeeping. The conclave's most recent intelligence estimate, gathered through years of careful observation and occasional spy work they thought humanity didn't know about, put the human fleet at around 200 warships, medium-class vessels mostly. Nothing extraordinary. That estimate was wrong by a very large number. The truth was something humanity had kept hidden for 60 years, since the early days of conclave membership, when a few very quiet, very serious people in the Terran government had looked at the galaxy around them and asked a simple question: what happens if they turn on us? No one had wanted to ask it out loud. It wasn't polite, it wasn't diplomatic, but the people who asked it quietly in private rooms were the kind of people who had read history, human history, the long, brutal, honest record of what happened to civilizations that were unprepared when the strong decided to take from the weak. They had drawn their conclusions, and then they had gone to work. Contingency Omega had been built slowly, piece by piece, over 6 decades. Shipyards hidden inside asteroids in the outer reaches of the solar system. Research programs listed under civilian budget codes, weapons development, disguised as mining technology. Every few years the plan was reviewed, updated, improved. Every generation of military leadership added something new to it. Nakamura herself had spent the last 15 years refining it, running simulations, stress testing the assumptions, looking for weaknesses. She had found very few. The council members listened as she began to lay it out. She was calm and precise. She spoke the way she always spoke, without drama, without decoration, just fact after fact, delivered in a voice that made each one feel like something solid you could hold in your hand. The real fleet numbered over 1,400 combat vessels, not the medium-class ships the Conclave thought it knew about. True warships, heavy cruisers, carrier platforms, fast attack ships, built for deep space combat. They had been constructed quietly over decades and stored in distributed locations across human-controlled space, many of them hidden in places the Conclave had never looked because they had never thought to look. Beyond the ships, there were the drone swarms, hundreds of millions of small, autonomous combat units, each one cheap to build and impossible to stop in sufficient numbers, all of them network through an adaptive AI system that could learn enemy tactics in real time and rewrite its own strategy faster than any biological commander could think. The Conclave had nothing like it. No one in the galaxy had anything like it as far as humanity's intelligence services could determine. There were the stealth systems, technology that made ships effectively invisible to every form of sensor the Conclave used. It had taken 30 years to develop and had been tested thoroughly in the outer systems without anyone noticing. The Conclave's admirals had built their war plans around knowing where human ships were. They were about to find out how badly that assumption would fail them. And then there were the soldiers. Nakamura did not spend much time on this part. She simply said that Terran ground forces were not what the Conclave believed they were. Enhancement programs, biological and mechanical, had been running for 2 decades. Human soldiers were faster than any Vreth. Fighters stronger and able to operate in conditions that would kill most species. They healed faster, they endured more, they kept going longer. She paused at this point because one of the council members, a civilian, the Minister of Civil Affairs, raised his hand and asked a question that was not about strategy. Should we attempt negotiations first? He asked. 30 cycles is time enough to. No, Nakamura said. She said it gently, because she understood why he was asking. They did not offer us negotiation. They offered a surrender with a deadline. If we go back to that table now, every species in the galaxy will see us do it, and they will understand what it means. She looked at him steadily. We will not kneel, not today, not because they told us to. The minister nodded slowly and said, nothing more. The vote was unanimous, all 14 hands. The Terran Union would not comply with the Conclave's terms. The Terran Union would fight. Nakamura gave her orders over the next 6 hours, a cascade of instructions going out to fleet commanders, research facilities, supply networks, and field officers across human space, all of it moving through encrypted channels the Conclave could not read. The machinery of Omega began to move for the first time in its 60-year existence. It moved smoothly because it had been designed to move smoothly. Every person who received an order knew their role. Every system that was activated responded as it was supposed to. Decades of preparation coming to life. All at once. Before she left the room, Nakamura drafted the Terran Union's official response to the Conclave's declaration. It was short. She read it aloud to the council before sending it, and the room was very quiet while she did. It said, the Terran Union acknowledges the Conclave's 30-cycle ultimatum. We suggest the Conclave use that time wisely. Say goodbye to the people you love. You are going to want to have done that. Someone in the council let out a slow breath. Someone else made a sound that was almost a laugh, not because it was funny, but because there was something in it that felt true and final and right. The message was sent on a colony world called Kepler's Reach. 3 days' travel from Earth, automated systems began to come online, systems that had been sitting dormant for years, waiting. Sensor grids expanded, defense platforms unlocked deep in the asteroid fields, beyond the colony's outer orbit. Ghost ships that had floated dark and silent for years powered up their engines one by one. They made no noise. They gave off no signal the Conclave could detect. They simply began to move quietly into position. The Conclave did not see them coming. They never did. Fleet Commander Drexler of the Vretha Gemini had fought in 4 wars. He had burned 2 colony worlds that refused Conclave authority. He had destroyed fleets, taken prisoners, and written reports about enemy casualties in the same tone that other people used to discuss whether he was not a cruel creature by nature. He simply did his job, and his job had always been to win, and he had always won. He was not worried about Kepler's Reach. His fleet numbered 812 warships, even accounting for the inflated estimates. His intelligence officers always warned him not to trust entirely. He had been told that humanity's full military presence in the Kepler's Reach system consisted of a single defense station, 3 patrol cruisers, and some planetary ground fortifications. He was coming with 800 ships, He gave the order to drop out of warp at 600 hours on the 4th day of the war. The fleet came out of warp in good order, spread across a wide formation. The way doctrine required, sensors came online immediately. Drexler stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched his officers begin their standard system sweep, cataloging what was in front of them, building the picture, preparing the targeting solutions. The picture that came back was wrong. Not wrong in a small way. Wrong in the way that made experienced officers go very still and speak very quietly and check their readings twice, and then a third time, because the numbers could not be right. The defense station was there, the patrol cruisers were there, but so was something else, a lot of something else. Weapons platforms, hundreds of them, arranged in overlapping fields of fire around the planet, powered up and locked on orbital mines, seated across the approach vectors in patterns that blocked every clean line of advance, and ships that had simply appeared from nowhere, dropping some kind of stealth field simultaneously, all at once, like a curtain being pulled back. Not 3 cruisers, not 30. 419 warships sitting in formation, already oriented toward his fleet, already locked and ready. They had been waiting. Sir, his sensor officer said very quietly, those ships, they weren't there. There was no signal, no power signature, nothing. They just... I can see what they did, Drexel said. His voice was steady. He had not gotten where he was by showing fear on his bridge. Battle formation, all weapons hot. We proceed as planned. He believed at that moment that numbers would carry the day. He had 800 ships. They had 400, even with the surprise, even with the platforms and the mines. The math still favored him. He had never done math like this before. The battle lasted 11 hours. In the first hour, his fleet drove forward through the minefield, taking losses, more losses than projected. Because the mines moved, they were not static. They tracked, they adjusted. Several of his destroyers were simply gone before anyone understood what was happening. In the second and third hours, his main force engaged the human fleet directly, and he began to understand that his ships were not performing the way they should. Human vessels moved faster than the specs suggested. Their weapons hit harder, their shielding absorbed more. Every time one of his captains thought he had found a pattern to exploit, the human ships changed their approach, not slowly, not after a delay, but immediately, as if they were reading his commander's minds. They were not reading minds, they were running on something else, something networked, something that processed information faster than any crew could, and shared it across the entire fleet. Real time. Drexel would learn this later. In the moment, it just felt like fighting something that couldn't be surprised. In the 5th hour, the drones came. They came from the asteroid belt beyond the planet, tiny things, each one barely worth a single shot, but they came in numbers that his point defense systems could not handle. Not thousands, millions, a cloud of them that rolled through space like a wave, absorbing fire, losing units by the thousands and not slowing down at all, because losing thousands out of millions meant nothing. They hit his rear formation and began taking apart ships with a patience and thoroughness that was almost mechanical. Because it was mechanical, because they were not afraid of dying, because they did not get tired. By the 8th hour, Drexel had lost more than 400 ships. He had destroyed 61 human vessels. He called for a retreat and found that the human fleet was already moving to cut off his escape. Vectors not reactively, but as if they had planned for exactly this, as if retreat had always been part of the trap. He lost another 200 ships getting out. He made it out with 109 out of 812. His ship was damaged, half his crew was dead. He sat in his command chair while his surviving officers worked in silence around him, and he tried to build a picture in his head of what had just happened. He tried to find the point where his plan had failed, where the mistake was, where the thing that went wrong had started. He could not find it because the mistake had not happened during the battle. The mistake had happened long before it, in some room somewhere on Earth, when someone in the conclave had decided that humanity was not worth taking seriously. He sent his report to the conclave high council. He sent it without softening the numbers, without diplomatic language, without the kind of careful phrasing officers used when they wanted to seem less defeated than they were. He sent the raw truth because he thought they needed it. The message said, "We lost 673 ships at Kepler's reach. Human losses were 61. They were prepared. They were completely prepared. They knew we were coming, and they had been ready for years. Do not send another fleet until you understand what you are dealing with." I am not sure we do yet. 2 days later, his damaged ship was intercepted by a human vessel. He prepared for a fight that never came. Instead, a small group of human soldiers came aboard, not aggressive, weapons lowered, moving carefully. They treated his wounded. They gave his crew food and water. They spoke to him through a translation device in calm, plain language, and told him he was a prisoner of war and that he would be treated according to the Terran Union's laws, which were very specific about how prisoners were to be handled. He had expected anger. He had expected punishment. He had expected the behavior of a species that had just been attacked and had defended itself with enormous violence. Instead, a young human medic sat next to one of his injured crew members for 3 hours, keeping the Vreth soldier calm, while a bone-setting procedure took place, holding the alien's hand, gesture that meant nothing in Vreth culture, but which the human did instinctively, because to a human, sitting with someone in pain and not leaving them alone was simply what you did. Drexel watched this from across the medical bay and felt something that he did not have a good word for, something uncomfortable and large that sat in the middle of his chest. He had spent his whole career thinking of war as a math problem, numbers of ships, numbers of casualties, resource costs versus strategic gains. These creatures didn't seem to think that way. They fought with the fury of something defending its home, and when the fighting was done, they turned around and treated the wounded enemy like a person. He didn't know what to do with that. He started writing a letter to the High Council, not a report this time, a warning. He wrote, "I have seen them fight, and I have seen them stop fighting. I am not sure which one frightened me more. These creatures do not fight because they are ordered to. They fight because they choose to, and when they choose to. There is nothing in the galaxy like it. Do not make the mistake of thinking this was a setback. This is what they are. This is what we woke up." The High Council received the letter. They read it. They set it aside. They were already planning the next attack. They had not yet understood the most Important thing about humanity that every attack would not weaken them. Every attack would only make them more certain, more focused, more resolved. Every battle the Conclave started was a battle humanity would finish. And humanity was very, very good at finishing things. Admiral Nakamura had a rule. She had followed it for her entire career, and she had never once broken it. The rule was this: do not wait for the enemy to come to you twice. After Kepler's reach, she gave the Conclave 4 days for the news to spread, for their admirals to receive their reports, for their councils to argue and panic and reorganize. She wanted them off balance before she moved. She wanted them reacting, not planning. She wanted them looking at the place they had already hit and worrying about it while her fleets were already somewhere else entirely. On the 5th day, she went on offense. It was not loud. It was not one massive strike that lit up every sensor in the galaxy. It was quiet, precise, and it happened in 17 places at once. Supply depots in the outer systems, communication relay stations that the Conclave used to coordinate fleet movement, shipyards tucked behind gas giants where Vreth vessels were being repaired and restocked, fuel lines that stretched across 3 star systems, feeding the Conclave's forward forces. The ghost ships moved through the dark. Without a signal, without a sound, they hit their targets and were gone before the enemy could respond. In some cases, Conclave stations didn't even know they'd been attacked until systems started going offline. A communication station in the Vreth outer territory simply stopped transmitting. A supply depot near the Conclave's 3rd Fleet was there 1 hour, and a debris field the next. No alarm had gone out, no distress signal had been sent, because there had been no time. Within a week, the Conclave's ability to coordinate across its outer territories had dropped by 40%. Their 3rd Fleet, which had been preparing to launch a second assault, found itself without fuel and spare parts and unable to move. Their admirals sent requests for resupply and received confused responses from stations that were no longer there. Nakamura read the intelligence reports each morning over her tea and made small notes on a physical paper map she kept on her desk. Old habit, something her grandfather had done. Every day more marks, every day the picture shifting in humanity's favor. She did not celebrate, she did not allow herself to feel satisfied. She had seen enough history to know that the most dangerous moment in any war was when you started thinking you were winning. She kept moving. The diplomatic teams followed the military advances, which was not how most species conducted war. Where human fleets secured a system, a small team of diplomats arrived with it. Days, not to occupy, not to demand loyalty, but to talk, to explain clearly and honestly that the Terran Union had no interest in punishing species that had voted for the war declaration under Vreth pressure. To lay out simple terms: stand down and nothing bad would happen to you. Continue fighting and nothing good would happen to you either. Several species accepted within the first month. A small reptilian race, called the Tishari, who had always been more afraid of the Vreth than they were loyal to them, sent a message to Vasquez saying they had never wanted this war and would take no further part in it. The Murak, a species of amphibian traders with 17 colony worlds, calculated the new odds and made the rational choice within 2 weeks of the Campaign start. Each defection made the conclave a little smaller, each withdrawal made Savith's coalition a little weaker. Then came the Queth. The Queth were small, they had 3 colony worlds, a fleet of 22 ships, and a population that any of the major species could have ignored entirely. Without feeling it, they had voted against the war declaration from the beginning. They had no military power worth mentioning. They had nothing to offer except their voice. But their ambassador, a quick-moving insectoid named Velquithrin, arrived at the Terran Union's forward command station on the 15th day of the war and asked to speak to someone in authority. He was brought to a conference room and given water and food. The Queth processed sugar well, and then a junior Terran officer sat down across from him and asked what he needed. What he needed, he said, was to formally ally the Queth people with the Terran Union, not in secret, publicly on the record where everyone could see it. The officer asked why the Queth were taking a serious risk. If the conclave survived this war, the Queth would pay a very heavy price. Velquithrin was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that the officer wrote down afterward and included in his report because he thought it was important. He said, "We have watched humanity for 80 years. We have seen how you argue and how you disagree and how you sometimes make each other very angry, but we have also seen how you treat the small ones, how you notice us when the powerful do, not how you remember what it is to be the weak one in the room." He paused. "If you lose this war, we lose something that galaxy cannot afford to lose, so we would rather lose it standing next to you than watching from far away." The alliance was formalized within 3 hours. It went out on every public channel in the conclave's communication network. The reaction was immediate. 17 conclave member species contacted the Terran Union within 48 hours asking about terms for neutrality. The conclave was fracturing. Sovreth saw it happening and did the thing that desperate leaders in losing positions often did. He stopped trying to win strategically and started trying to strike something that hurt. He stopped thinking about fleets and supply lines and started thinking about symbols. He chose Earth. The plan was straightforward: a strike fleet of 300 ships. Everything he could still coordinate would hit the Sol system directly. Earth was the heart of the Terran Union. Earth was where their government sat, where their history lived, where nearly 1 billion people still made their home. Destroy it or even threaten it credibly enough, and the Union would have to pull back its forces, have to negotiate, have to stop the campaign that was dismantling the conclave piece by piece. The strike fleet dropped out of warp into the Sol system, ready for a fight. They found something that stopped them dead for several long, terrible seconds. Earth was not undefended. It was not lightly defended. It was not even moderately defended. What they found around the 3rd planet of the human home system was the most heavily fortified position any of his admirals had ever seen in their lives. Defense platforms in layered rings, an orbital grid of weapons emplacements that covered every possible approach angle, and waiting there in clean formation, a human fleet that numbered over 600 warships, ships that had not been committed to the outer campaign, ships that had been held back, saved specifically for this. Every vessel in the Vreth strike fleet was already being tracked. Target locks were established before they had finished their entry sweep. On all open frequencies, a human voice spoke. It was calm and it was clear. It said, "You have entered Terran Union. Sovereign space without permission. You are outnumbered and outgunned. This system has been held by humanity since before we knew anyone else existed in the universe. We suggest you think very carefully about the next thing you decide to do." Draxel, still a prisoner on a human facility elsewhere in the system, heard about the standoff through a guard who told him the news the way someone might describe something they had just watched out a window, matter of fact, almost bored. "They walked right into it," the guard said, shaking his head slightly. Draxel said nothing. He had been writing his letter to the High Council every day. Since his capture, he had been warning them every day. They had not listened. He thought about what he had seen on the human medical ship. He thought about the medic who had held his soldier's hand. He thought about the food they had given his crew and the respectful language they had used and the laws they had cited to explain why prisoners had rights. He picked up his writing pad and continued the letter. He wrote, "I have tried to explain what these people are. I have tried to find the words. Let me try once more. They are not like us. They are not like anyone. They remember pain, and that memory makes them careful. And their carefulness makes them terrifying. You hit their home. You threatened everything they love, and they were ready. They are always ready. This is not a war we can win. This is not a war we ever could have won. The only question left is how much we lose before we understand that." He finished the letter. He sent it through the prisoner communication channel the humans had provided because they had a prisoner communication channel because their laws said prisoners could contact their governments because that was the kind of species they were. This time, someone in the High Council read it all the way to the end. The Battle of Earth lasted 6 hours, not because it was close, but because 300 ships take time to destroy even when you are doing it efficiently. When it was over, humanity's losses numbered 11 ships. The Vreth strike fleet was gone. Sovreth received the news in silence. Then he sat for a long time doing nothing at all. His advisors waited. Finally, one of them asked what they should do next. Sovreth looked at the losses report. He looked at the numbers from every engagement over the past 8 weeks. He looked at the map of Conclave space and all the marks on it where human forces had struck, and the list of species that had withdrawn from the coalition one by one. He said, "Find out who humanity talks to about ending wars." It was the first smart decision he had made since the war began. The Vreth homeworld of Vretha Prime was a cold gray place. Its cities were built from dark stone, tall and dense, full of sharp angles and narrow streets. Everything about it spoke of a people who valued order and control. Streets that ran in perfect straight lines, buildings that never curved, a sky that was always the same pale shade of nothing, as if even the weather had been told to behave itself. It was a proud world. It had never been touched by outside forces, not once in 600 years of Vreth history had an enemy fleet stood in orbit above it. Admiral Nakamura's fleet arrived on the 91st day of the war. She came with 400 ships. The Vreth had nothing left to meet them. What remained of the hegemony's fighting Force was scattered and broken, some units hiding in deep space, some that had already surrendered to human advanced teams, some that had simply gone dark and were no longer responding to orders. The conclave itself had stopped functioning as a governing body 2 weeks earlier, when enough member species had withdrawn their support to make the council chamber unable to reach a legal vote on anything. Nakamura put her fleet in orbit above Vretha Prime and did not fire a single shot. She sent a message to the surface. She sent it in plain language, no encryption, on a frequency that every comm system on the planet could receive. She said, "This is Admiral Hiron Nakamura of the Terran Defense Force. Vretha Prime is surrounded. The war is over. I am requesting direct contact with High Chancellor Sovrith to discuss terms. No one on this world will be harmed while those discussions take place. That is a promise from the Terran Union, and we keep our promises." It took 3 hours for Sovrith to respond. When he did, he looked smaller than Ambassador Vasquez remembered. Not physically, he was still tall, still wide-shouldered, still the same creature who had stood in the great hall of the conclave and declared war with a cold smile on his face, but something in him had gone down. The way he sat, the way he held his hands, the way he looked at the camera with eyes that were steady but not confident. He connected directly to Vasquez, who was on Nakamura's flagship. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke. She thought he might say something proud, some final performance of strength. Before he gave in, he surprised her. He said, "I expected you to be angrier." "I am angry," Vasquez said. "I am very angry, but I am a professional, and so are you, and we have work to do." She placed a document on the screen in front of him. She gave him a moment to begin reading it. It was called the Terran Peace Accord. Sovrith read it slowly, then he read it again, then he looked up at Vasquez with an expression she could not quite read. He had expected punishment. That was what you did when you won a war. You punished the loser. You took their territory. You put your own people in their government. You made them small so they could never threaten you again. Every species he knew did this. Every war in recorded galactic history had ended this way. The winner took what they could. That was how the universe worked. The Terran Peace Accord said none of that. It said the Vreth hegemony would pay reparations, a structured payment over 40 years that was significant but not designed to their economy. It said Vreth military forces would be reduced to a level sufficient for defense only, and that this reduction would be verified by a neutral oversight body. It said that war crimes committed during the conflict, and there had been some on a small Queth settlement that a Vreth commander had struck in defiance of orders, would be investigated and prosecuted through an independent court. And then it said something else, something Sovrith had not expected at all. It said the Galactic Conclave was to be dissolved and replaced by a new body, the Galactic Assembly. In this new assembly, every species would have equal representation, regardless of size, power, or age. No species could be outvoted by simple majority on decisions that affected their own territory or people. Every species, even the smallest, even the ones with 3 colony worlds and 22 ships, would have a voice that counted for exactly as much as anyone else's. Sovrith looked up. "You are not taking any seats of power in this assembly." "No," Vasquez said. You are nominating the Queth and two other minor species to the first Leadership Council. Yes. Why? She was quiet for a moment. She thought about how to say it and decided that simple and honest was better than anything clever. Because we have been the small ones in the room, she said, we remember what it felt like. We remember what it felt like to sit in the back row while the powerful ones made decisions that affected us without asking what we thought. We are not going to build the same room and just move to the front of it. Savrith looked at the document for a long time. Outside the window behind Vasquez, he could see the edge of his planet's horizon, the gray-blue curve of Rathat Prime, floating in space with 400 human warships above it and not a single weapon fired. He said, you could have destroyed us. Yes, she said. You chose not to. Yes. Because of your laws. Because of our memory, she said, we remember what it felt like when someone tried to destroy us. We didn't fight this war to rule the galaxy. We fought it because you told us we had to kneel. And we don't kneel. She paused. We never have. Savreth signed the accord. He signed it with the same stylus he had used to sign the original war declaration, which Vasquez thought was either very ironic or very fitting, and she was not entirely sure which. The news spread across the galaxy within hours. The Galactic Conclave was finished. The Galactic Assembly would begin its first session in 60 days. Humanity, which had just won the most significant war in recent galactic history, declined every offer to take a leadership seat and went back to doing what it had always done, sending its people out into the dark, building things, talking to everyone, arguing loudly with itself, and somehow stubbornly surviving. Drexel was released from custody on the 93rd day of the war. He was given back his personal belongings, a clean chain of clothes, and a meal before he left, because the humans had a rule about that. No one left a Terran facility without a meal. He didn't know why. He didn't ask. He ate the food and found it strange, but not bad. A young human officer walked him to the transport that would take him home. They stood at the door for a moment in the awkward way that people stand when they know they are parting and are not quite sure what to say. Drexel said, your people are very strained. The officer considered this. Probably. He said, you fight like nothing I have ever seen, Drexel said, and then you stop. And you offer food to the people you were just fighting. I don't understand it. The officer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think it's because we've been on both sides. We've been the ones who had everything taken. We've been the ones doing the taking. We've tried it both ways. He shrugged. The second way feels worse even when you win. Drexel thought about this for a long time on the journey home. When he arrived on Vretha Prime, the first thing he did was go and see his family. His children were young enough that they didn't fully understand what had happened, what the war had meant, what they had almost lost. They were just glad to see him. They held onto his arms and asked him what space was like and whether he'd seen any interesting aliens. He told them yes, he had seen some very interesting aliens. Later that night, after the children were asleep, he sat at his desk and finished the letter he had been writing to the High Council throughout his captivity. He had been writing it for weeks. He had been trying to find the right words for weeks. he decided that he had finally found them. He wrote, "I have tried to explain what humanity is. I have tried to describe their weapons and their tactics and their technology, but none of that is what you need to understand. What you need to understand is this: they were ready because they were afraid of us. Not afraid the way a weak thing is. Afraid. Afraid the way an intelligent thing is. Afraid. The kind of fear that makes you work, that makes you prepare, that makes you stay up late and run simulations and build hidden fleets and keep secrets for 60 years just in case. They were afraid of us, and that fear made them into something we couldn't beat. And when they beat us, when they stood above our world with 400 ships and all the power they needed to end us, they stopped. They stopped because their fear never made them cruel. It only made them ready. I have never encountered anything more dangerous in my life, and I have never encountered anything that gave me more reason to believe that the galaxy, in spite of everything, might be worth saving." He finished the letter. He sent it. He did not know if anyone would read it. Carefully this time, he hoped they would. He thought that perhaps in the new assembly, in the new way of doing things, there might be more people willing to listen carefully, more people willing to sit with uncomfortable things and think about them honestly. He hoped so. He went to bed. Above him, far away, the stars were the same as they had always been, old, quiet, indifferent to the small creatures moving through the dark between them. But the small creatures were not indifferent to each other. They were watching and learning and making decisions, some good and some terrible, and occasionally stumbling into something that changed everything. The Conclave had declared war on humanity, believing it would be quick and clean and easily forgotten. A minor correction, a small problem, dealt with firmly. Instead, it had been the moment the galaxy learned what humanity actually was. Not the most powerful species, not the most ancient, not the wisest or the most advanced or the most perfectly evolved for survival in a hostile universe. Just the most stubborn, the most prepared, the most unwilling to be told that they had no right to stand where they stood, and perhaps, just perhaps, the most willing to win a war and then turn around and try to build something better out of the wreckage. The galaxy would not make the same mistake again. More importantly, the galaxy would not forget. And